A few meters away from the television stood a generator, along with gallons of gasoline. The soldiers came out of their tents as the staff sergeant led us to the back of the house, where none of us had been before. There were more than 30 boys there, two of whom, Sheku and Josiah, were 7 and 11 years old. The rest of us were between the ages of 13 and 16, except Kanye, who was now 17. A soldier wearing civilian clothes with a whistle around his neck stepped up to a rack of AK-47s and handed one to each of us. When the soldier stood in front of me, I avoided eye contact, so he straightened my head until my eyes met his. He gave me the gun. I held it in my trembling hand. He then added the magazine, and I shook even more. "It seems that all of you have two things in common," the soldier said after he had finished testing all of us. "You are afraid of looking a man in the eye and afraid of holding a gun. Your hands tremble as if the gun is pointed at your head." He walked up and down the line for a bit and continued, "This gun," he held the AK-47 high up, "will soon belong to you, so you better learn not to be afraid of it. That's all for today." That night I stood at the entrance of my tent for a while, hoping my friends would come out to talk, but no one did. Alhaji stepped out and looked in my direction for a few minutes, but then he turned and just stared at the ground. I was about to walk to him when he re-entered his tent. I inhaled the cool night breeze, which brought with it the scent of marijuana. I sighed, went back into my tent, and sat on the tarp all night, unable to sleep. I just sat with my head in my hands, thoughtless. It was the first night that I was awake alone without having a migraine. As I began to ponder why this was the case, a cock started crowing, though it was still dark outside. The confused cock crowed throughout the night until morning finally arrived. My two tent companions, Sheku and Josiah, the two youngest boys, were still sleeping when the bell rang at 6 a.m. for us to rise for training. "Come on, let's go." I tried to wake them with a gentle shake. They just rolled over out to their sides and continued sleeping. I had to drag them off the mat by their legs and slap them until they woke up. The soldiers were already going from tent to tent, dragging out those who were still asleep and splashing buckets of water on them. We met at the training ground, and new crap sneakers were distributed, along with army shorts and t-shirts that were of all colors. Some people got Adidas and others Nikes. I got a black Reebok pump and was happier with my new craps than anything else that was going on. I took up my old pants, which contained my rap cassettes. As I was putting on my new army shorts, a soldier took my old pants and threw them into the blazing fire that had been set to burn our old belongings. I ran toward the fire, but the cassettes had already started to melt. Tears formed in my eyes, and my lips shook as I turned away. After we put on our new attire, we formed a horizontal line with legs apart and hands straight up at our sides. As we stood waiting, some of the soldiers returned from the front line and reloaded their guns and side packs with ammunition. Some had blood on their uniforms and faces, which they didn't seem to notice or simply ignored. They quickly ate breakfast and were on their way back to where they didn't look as if they wanted to return. Each soldier stood against the wall, took several deep breaths with his eyes closed, and gripped his gun tightly before beginning to run back toward the clearing. Sheku and Josiah stood next to me, as if sharing a tent with them meant that I had become their big brother. They watched me during the exercise and followed what I did instead of the soldier who introduced himself as Corporal Gaddafi. He was a young fellow, younger than the lieutenant and the staff sergeant, but he was bald and his countenance made him look much older. He had an intense face that looked, even smiling, as if he were chewing something sour. First we ran around the building for a few minutes, then we began to learn how to crawl in the bushes nearby. Corporal Gaddafi would hold up his fist, and when he brought it down, we felt the bushes and crawled quickly, without producing much sound, until we reached a designated tree. Then we immediately got up and crouched to take cover behind other trees. Afterward, we'd run back to the training ground. The corporal didn't say much during the initial state of training. All he said was, "Not bad, terrible, and faster." He mostly used hand gestures, which he said was the only thing that'd be used once we were out there. He'd point to the clearing where words could cost you a bullet in the head. He would then smile dryly and widen his eyes for us to laugh with him. After we had done the running and crawling and crouching many times, we were allowed to have some bread and custard. The corporal gave us 1 minute to get the food and eat it. Wherever we hadn't eaten was taken away at the end of 60 seconds. None of us was able to finish eating on the first day, but within a week, we could eat any food in a minute. It was the only part of the training that we mastered. After the late breakfast, we lined up facing the corporal, who handed us AK-47s. When it was my turn, he looked at me intensely, as if he were trying to tell me that he was giving me something worth cherishing. He poked my chest with his finger and walked around me. When he came back to the front, he stared at me some more, his red eyes and dark face twitching. He bared his teeth as if he were preparing to attack, and my legs began to shake when he started to smile. Before I could smile with him, he had stopped, and the veins on his forehead stood up. Still looking at me, he reached into the wooden crate and pulled out a gun. He took out the magazine and handed me the AK with two hands. I hesitated for a bit, but he pushed the gun against my chest. With trembling hands, I took the gun, saluted him, and ran to the back of the line, still holding the gun, but afraid to look at it. I had never held a gun that long before, and it frightened me. The closest thing to it had been a toy gun made out of bamboo when I was 7. My playmates and I carved them and played war games in the coffee farms and unfinished buildings in my grandmother's village. Paw paw, we would go, and whoever did it first would announce to the rest whom he had killed. We continued the training exercises we had been doing earlier in the morning, but this time we carried with us our AK-47s that didn't contain any ammunition. We crawled with the guns on our backs and our hands and ran around the building with them. The guns were a little heavy for Sheku and Josiah, who kept dropping them and picking them up as we went along. We broke for a minute lunch and began a different drill. We were taken to a nearby banana farm where we practiced stabbing the banana trees with bayonets. Visualize the banana tree as the enemy, the rebels who killed your parents, your family, and those who are responsible for everything that has happened to you, the corporal screamed. Is that how you stab someone who had killed your family? He asked. This is how I would do it. He took out his bayonet and started shouting and stabbing the banana tree. First, I stab him in the stomach, then the neck, then his heart, and I will cut it out and show it to him, and then pluck out his eyes. Remember, he probably killed your parents. Or worse. Continue. He wiped his knife with the banana leaves. When he said this, we all got angry and drove our knives in and out of the banana trees until they fell to the ground. Good, he said, nodding and pondering something that made him smile longer than usual. Over and over in our training, he would say the same sentence. Visualize the enemy, the rebels who killed your parents, your family, and those who are responsible for everything that has happened to you. That afternoon, we learned how to put the magazine into the gun and other such basics. Ignore the safety pin, they said. It will only slow you down. That evening, we learned to fire our guns, aiming at plywood boards mounted in the branches of tiny trees at the edge of the forest. Sheku and Josiah weren't strong enough to raise their weapons, so the corporal gave them each a high stool to keep the weapons from falling. At the end of the shooting exercise, we were taught how to dismantle our guns and oil them, because the AKs were so old that they would misfire randomly and sometimes stop working altogether. That night, as soon as we got under the tent, my tent companions passed out. Instead of smiling in their sleep, Seku went paw paw boom, and Josiah went 1 2, the numbers we had recited as we stabbed the banana trees. But even though I was exhausted, I couldn't sleep. My ears rang with the gun sounds, my body ached, and my index finger was sore. There had been no time to think all day, but now I could. I could become angry, yes, begin to visualize scenarios of shooting or stabbing a rebel. The rebels are responsible for everything that has happened to you. I imagined capturing several rebels at once, locking them inside a house, sprinkling gasoline on it, and tossing a match. We would watch it burn, and I laughed. I was distracted by the humming of a boy named Lansana. He was 3 tents down from me, and he sometimes hummed melodies of songs I had never heard until he fell asleep. He started doing this after our first shooting exercise. His voice would echo in the dark forest, and whenever he stopped, the night got quieter.